What would you do if you had nothing left but the clothes on your back, an old horse, and a single $10 coin? What if the only thing that $10 could buy was a place everyone else had thrown away? A pile of rotting wood and broken stone that the world called cursed. For 19-year-old Mary Coulter, this wasn't a question. It was the only choice she had. She spent her last $10 on an abandoned fur trading fort outside Laramie, a place of ghosts and warnings that nobody had dared touch in 50 years. But the truth waiting for her under the cold, hard ground was a secret that would not only save her life, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in and stay close as we tell the story of the girl who bought a ruin and found a kingdom. Mary Coulter arrived at the edge of the Wyoming Territory looking like a ghost herself. She was thin and worn, her father's canvas coat hanging loose on her narrow frame. The dust of 3 states settled into its seams. Her face, framed by sun-bleached hair tied back with a leather thong, was stoic, but her eyes held the deep, quiet ache of someone who had lost everything. The Coulter Ranch, the only home she had ever known, was gone, swallowed by debt and drought after the fever took her parents in the spring. All she had left was Silas, her father's aging gray gelding, a bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, and the heavy, silver dollar-sized $10 coin her mother had pressed into her hand years ago, whispering, "For a true emergency." The emergency had come and gone, leaving only this last cold piece of her past. She had ridden until the money ran out, until the kindness of strangers wore thin, until she found herself walking into the dusty mercantile in Laramie with the sole purpose of buying enough oats for Silas to make it one more day. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee, cured tobacco, and dry goods. 2 men were leaning against the counter, their voices low and gravelly. "Another season and it'll be flat to the ground," one of them said, spitting a brown stream of juice into a nearby spittoon. "Good riddance. Cursed ground, that place." The other man, the shopkeeper, nodded as he wiped down the counter. "Town's owned it for back taxes since before the war. $10 is what's owed. Might as well be $1 million. Nobody's fool enough to pay 10 cents for Blackwood's folly." Mary stood by a barrel of flour, her hand frozen on its way to her pocket. Cursed ground. $10. The exact amount she had. She listened as they spoke of the old Blackwood trading fort, a place abandoned in a hurry half a century ago after some unspoken violence. They said the winters there were colder, the wind keener, and that no man who tried to reclaim it had ever stayed past the first snow. The men laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. But Mary wasn't listening to their laughter. She was listening to the echo of her mother's voice, to the cold weight of the coin in her pocket. For the first time in months, she felt not the pull of the past, but the faintest whisper of a future. A future made of cursed ground and splinters, perhaps, but one she could own. She left the mercantile without the oats, the men's laughter following her out into the relentless sun. Her decision was made. $10 was everything she had. She would spend it on the only thing in the world that asked for nothing more. Mary walked to the town clerk's office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of stale paper and beeswax. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger, his expression souring as he took in her dusty appearance. "What is it?" he asked, his tone implying she was wasting his valuable time. "I heard," Mary began, her voice quiet but steady, "that the old Blackwood fort is for sale, for the price of the back taxes." The clerk blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. He pushed his visor up on his forehead. "You mean Blackwood's folly?" Girl, that place is nothing but a woodpile waiting for a lightning strike. The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Mary didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and placed the heavy $10 coin on the worn wooden counter. The sound it made was definitive, solid. The clerk stared at the coin, then back at her face. He saw no doubt, only a flat, unyielding resolve. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips as if he were party to a grand joke. "Your money," he said, scooping up the coin. He pulled a dusty yellow deed from a drawer, scrawled a few lines, stamped it with a heavy seal, and pushed it across the counter. "It's yours. All 160 acres of rocks, wind, and ghosts. Good luck to you." She took the paper, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her coat. As she walked out, she could hear the clerk already telling the story to the man who'd just entered, his voice full of amusement. She had just become the fool of Laramie. She had just bought a home. What was she thinking? A young girl alone, buying a place legends were built on, and not the good kind. Was it desperation, or did some deeper instinct guide her hand? What secret was sleeping inside those crumbling walls, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose? Let us know in the comments what you would have done with your last $10. And be sure to subscribe, because Mary's journey into the heart of Blackwood's Folly was just beginning. As Mary stepped out of the clerk's office and into the harsh afternoon light, a booming laugh cut through the street noise. "Well, I'll be. Is that the deed to the old Blackwood place?" The voice belonged to a man named Barlow, a rancher whose land bordered the abandoned fort. He was a big man, florid and loud, his wealth evident in his tailored coat and the silver conchos on his saddle. He'd been a rival of her father's, always looking to expand, always sneering at their smaller, hard-scrabble operation. He dismounted, walking toward her with a swagger. "Heard you bought it. $10 for a lifetime supply of splinters and nightmares." He looked her up and down, a cruel smirk on his face. "What's the matter, Coulter? Finally run out of options? I'll give you 20 for it right now, double your money. I could use the firewood." Mary simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, which seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. "Fine," he spat. "Go on up to your castle. We'll start calling you Fort Mary." He laughed again, turning to the men loafing outside the saloon. "Hear that, boys? We got ourselves some new royalty." The men chuckled along with him. Mary turned her back on their mockery and walked toward the livery to fetch Silas, the deed a small, warm square against her chest. Her path out of town took her past the mission church. Sitting on a simple wooden bench in the shade of a cottonwood was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a stillness that seemed ancient. She was Arapaho, her dress a mix of traditional beadwork and worn calico. As Mary passed, the woman spoke, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "The ground remembers what the walls forget," she said, not looking at Mary, but out toward the distant, hazy mountains where the fort lay. "Listen to the cold." Mary stopped, turning to face her. The woman's eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment. There was no pity in her gaze, only a strange, solemn weight. Mary nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a gift she didn't understand, and then continued on her way. The words settled inside her, cryptic and heavy, another secret to add to the one she now owned. She needed to get her few possessions to the fort, and there was only one person she could ask. Jedediah Stone was a freighter, a man whose face was as weathered as old leather, and he had been her father's closest friend. She found him loading his wagon near the rail yard. He saw her approach, and his expression softened with a sorrow he didn't voice. She explained her purchase simply, without shame or justification. He didn't laugh. He didn't question her sanity. He just looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll haul your things," he said. "Be ready at dawn." The next morning, Jed's wagon rumbled to a stop, where a faint, overgrown track veered off the main road. This was the path to Blackwood's Folly. He helped her unload her bedroll, her father's toolbox, and the few other meager items she possessed. He pressed a small sack into her hands. "Some salt pork and coffee," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "A man's got to eat." He looked up the track, then back at her, his concern a palpable thing. "You're sure about this, Mary?" She just nodded. "It's mine, Jed." He sighed, climbing back onto his wagon. "You watch yourself out here. That place, it has a history." With a final, worried glance, he cracked his whip and the wagon lumbered away, leaving Mary alone with Silas, her belongings, and the silent, waiting wilderness. The road ahead was barely visible, swallowed by sagebrush and thyme. The walk to the fort was longer than she expected, nearly 2 miles over rising, rocky ground. The air grew thinner, and a persistent wind began to whisper through the sparse pines, carrying a distinct chill that had nothing to do with the autumn afternoon. Silas walked beside her, his head low, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The land was starkly beautiful, a sweep of gray-green sage and pale, sun-bleached rock under an immense blue sky. But it felt watchful, indifferent. As she rounded a final bend, she saw it. Blackwood's Folly. The clerk hadn't been lying. It was a ruin. The high palisade walls that once enclosed the compound were mostly gone, reduced to jagged stumps of rotting timber. The main building, a long, 2-story log structure, sagged in the middle, its roof a gaping maw open to the sky on one end. Several smaller outbuildings were little more than heaps of collapsed logs. It looked as though a giant had stepped on it and moved on. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. Barlow's laughter echoed in her ears. Had she traded her last dollar for a grave? The wind picked up, moaning through the broken timbers, and Silas shied, his breath puffing out in a nervous cloud. She would not be defeated before she even began. She decided against trying to sleep in the main building. It felt too broken, too exposed. Instead, she found a small, detached structure that might have been a smithy or a stable. One wall had crumbled, but the other 3 and most of the roof were intact. It offered shelter from the wind. She led Silas inside, his hooves echoing on the packed earth floor. Using a piece of canvas from her pack, she covered the collapsed opening as best she could. She gathered dry wood from the fallen palisade fence and built a small, careful fire just outside the doorway. As dusk bled across the sky, turning the clouds to shades of violet and rose, she sat on an old stump, sipping hot, bitter coffee from a tin cup. The loneliness was a physical presence, as real as the horse beside her and the crackling flames before her. She had bought a pile of splinters and ghosts, just as they'd said. She wrapped herself in her bedroll, leaning against Silas for warmth, and listened to the fort settle around her. The wind was a constant voice, crying and whispering through the ruins. Exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her into a shallow, uneasy sleep. Sometime in the deep, moonless dark, a sound woke her. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, resonant thrumming, a vibration that seemed to come not through the air, but up from the very ground beneath her. It was deep and steady, like a slow heartbeat in the earth, emanating from the direction of the main house. Silas was awake too, his head up, ears pricked, a low tremble running through his body. The sound lasted only a moment, then faded into silence. The next morning, under a pale and watery sun, Mary forced herself to enter the main trading post. The interior was a disaster of decay. Dirt, leaves, and the debris of half a century lay thick on the floor. Pack rat nests were piled in the corners, and the faint, dusty smell of abandonment hung in the air. Sunlight streamed through the collapsed section of the roof, illuminating a chaotic jumble of broken furniture and rotted timbers. Her heart sank further. This would take more than hard work. It might take a miracle. She started in the one part of the large room that was still protected by a solid roof, what must have been the factor's office and main trading area. A long, heavy counter, scarred and pitted, still stood against one wall. She picked up a splintered broom she'd found in the smithy and began the monumental task of sweeping, of imposing some small order on the chaos. As she cleared away the thickest layers of dust and grime, she began to notice the floor. It was made of thick, hand-hewn planks, wide and solid. But as she worked her way toward the center of the room, she saw an anomaly. A large, rectangular section of the floor, perhaps 10 feet by 6, was different. The planks were a darker wood, possibly cedar, and they were fitted together with a carpenter's precision, the seams almost invisible. Unlike the surrounding floor, which was face-nailed with crude iron spikes, these boards showed no hardware at all. She knelt, running a calloused hand over the strange section. The wood was smooth, almost polished by time, but what struck her was the temperature. It was cold, not just cool, but a deep, penetrating cold, like cellar stone, a chill that seemed to emanate from deep below. The memory of the Arapaho woman's words surfaced with startling clarity. Listen to the cold. This was it. This had to be what she meant. She pressed her ear to the planks, but heard only silence. Silas, whom she had tethered just outside the main door, let out a low, uneasy whinny, pulling at his rope. He stared at the spot where she knelt. His nostrils flared. His animal sense felt the same wrongness she did. She went back to sweeping, her eyes scanning every inch of the cold wood. And then she saw it. On the edge of a single plank, almost hidden in the grain, was a small, carved mark. It was no bigger than her thumb, a beautifully rendered, stylized beaver, its tail arched. It wasn't a random doodle. It was a sign, a key. She traced its outline with her finger, a shiver running up her arm that had nothing to do with the chill of the wood. Someone had sealed this floor for a reason. Mary knew she couldn't tackle the mystery of the floor right away. Survival came first. The days shortened, and the cold in the wind grew a sharper edge. Before she could explore secrets, she had to have a roof over her head that didn't leak, and walls that could stand up to a Wyoming winter. She began to work with a quiet, relentless fury. Her father had taught her how to use tools, how to read the grain of wood, how to build things that last. She salvaged the best logs from the collapsed sections of the fort, her axe ringing out in the silent valley from dawn until dusk. She started with the small smithy, rebuilding the crumbled wall stone by stone, chinking the logs with a mixture of mud and dry grass until it was airtight. She mended the roof, nailing down salvaged planks with old square nails she'd painstakingly straightened. It became her cabin, a single, snug room for herself and a sturdy stall for Silas. Every swing of the hammer, every log she lifted, was an act of defiance against the town's mockery, against her own despair. The labor was grueling, but it was honest. It scoured her mind of grief, leaving only the satisfying ache of tired muscles and the tangible proof of her progress. Silas was her constant, silent companion. He stood patiently for hours, his presence a warm, living anchor in the vast loneliness. While she worked, the fort slowly gave up more of its secrets. Tucked away on a high shelf in the office, she found a leather-bound ledger. Most of its pages were a fused, water-damaged brick of paper, but a few in the middle were miraculously preserved. The handwriting was elegant, precise French. She could only make out a few words, but the numbers and inventories were clear. Lists of pelts: castor, loutre, renard argenté, beaver, otter, silver fox. The quantities were staggering. On the last legible page was a name, written with a flourish: Jean Dubois, facteur. And next to his name, a small, perfect ink drawing of the same stylized beaver she had found carved into the floor. The cold patch in the main room was a constant, silent question. Every evening she would go and stand on it, feeling that unnatural chill seep through the soles of her worn boots. The place held a memory of cold. Finally, after a month of back-breaking labor, her small cabin was secure. A stack of firewood stood shoulder-high against the wall. She had a home. Now she could listen to the cold. She took her father's tools, a heavy claw hammer and a long steel pry bar, and walked into the main building. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. She knelt beside the beaver carving and found the finest of seams. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into it and put her weight against the end. The old wood groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the handle of the tool and up into her bones. But it didn't move. It was sealed as tight as a tomb. Mary repositioned the pry bar, finding a new point of leverage. She threw her entire body into it, her muscles screaming with the effort. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, and the end of the plank lifted a fraction of an inch. A puff of air escaped from the opening, and with it, an extraordinary scent. It was the smell of a deep, cold cellar, of ancient stone, but also of cedar wood, rich leather, and something else. A clean, faintly wild, musky aroma. It was the smell of well-cured fur. Heart-pounding, she worked the pry bar down the length of the board, breaking the hidden seal. With a final, groaning complaint, the plank came free. She set it aside and peered into the darkness below. A set of steep stone steps led down into blackness. Lighting her kerosene lantern, she held it over the opening. The flickering light fell upon a small, stone-lined chamber, a vault carved from the very rock beneath the fort. It was not empty. It was filled, stacked to the ceiling with neat, canvas-wrapped bales, all of them tied with leather cord and marked with a stenciled beaver. The last shipment, the one that never left. It had been waiting here, in the cold and the dark, for 50 years. She descended the steps, the lantern light dancing across the walls. The air was frigid, preserving everything in a state of suspended time. She ran her hand over one of the bales. The canvas was dry and brittle but intact. With trembling fingers, she untied the cord on the nearest one and peeled back a corner of the wrapping. The fur beneath was breathtaking. It was a beaver pelt, but unlike any she had ever seen. The guard hairs shone with a deep, liquid luster, the undercoat thick and soft as velvet. It was a prime winter pelt, perfectly preserved. She opened another bale and another, silver fox, its fur like spun moonlight, ermine white as fresh snow, marten, otter, fisher. It was a treasure trove, a fortune in fur that defied imagination. Tucked into a small, carved niche in the back wall of the vault, her light fell upon something else, a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox. It wasn't large, but it was dense and formidable. There was no keyhole. Instead, its lid was adorned with a series of numbered brass dials. On the lid, an inscription had been carefully engraved in the same elegant script as the ledger. Pour ma fille, Cécile. For my daughter, Cécile. Lying beside the box was a small packet wrapped in oilskin. She carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a letter, the paper miraculously preserved. My dearest Cécile, it began. It was from Jean Dubois. He wrote of sudden violence, of an attack on the fort that had forced them to flee. He had hidden the Hudson's Bay Company's furs and his own life savings, intending to return for them as soon as it was safe. He never did. The letter gave the combination to the strongbox, a sequence of numbers based on her birthday. He wrote of his love for her, his hope for their future. With shaking hands, Mary turned the dials. The tumblers clicked into place. She lifted the heavy lid. It was filled with gold coins, a small fortune in itself. But beneath the gold were more personal treasures. A miniature portrait of a dark-eyed little girl, a silver locket, and a small bundle of child's drawings of birds and horses. This wasn't just a cache of wealth. It was a father's desperate, final act of love. As Mary stood in the silent, frozen vault, a howl of wind from the world above reminded her she was not safe yet. An early, violent snow had begun to fall. The storm hit with a fury that seemed personal, a physical assault of wind and blinding snow. The sky, the land, everything vanished into a churning vortex of white. Mary scrambled to get the heavy plank back over the vault opening, then rushed to bring Silas from his stall into the relative shelter of the main building. The blizzard was a test of every repair she had made, every nail she had driven. The wind shrieked through the old logs, and snow driven like sand scoured the walls. She huddled by the small stone fireplace in the factor's office, feeding it precious wood, the warmth barely pushing back the invasive cold. The discovery beneath her feet felt unreal, a dream from another life. The weight of it was immense. This wasn't a windfall to be squandered. It was a trust. Jean Dubois had left his legacy in her care, and she felt a profound, unspoken duty to him and to the memory of his lost daughter. For 2 days, the storm raged. On the second afternoon, over the ceaseless howl of the wind, she heard a new sound, a faint, desperate cry. She pulled on her heavy coat and fought her way to the door. Through the maelstrom, she could just make out a dark shape, a broken-down wagon half buried in a snowdrift on the old track. A man was stumbling toward the fort, carrying a small, bundled figure. He collapsed a few yards from her door. Mary dragged him inside, the snow and wind blasting into the room. He was Thomas, a homesteader, and the bundle in his arms was his son, a boy of about 7, pale and shivering with fever. Their wagon had lost a wheel just as the storm hit. They had been stranded for a day, their fire gone out. Without a second's hesitation, Mary went to work. She settled them by the fire, wrapping the boy in her own bedroll and every spare blanket she could find. She brewed hot, sweet coffee for the father and a weak broth for the child. She sacrificed her carefully rationed supplies without a thought. For the next day and night, she was no longer just a survivor. She was a protector. The fort, which had been her solitary refuge, transformed into a sanctuary for others. As she tended to the sick boy, bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, she thought of the little girl in the portrait, Cécile. This act of care felt like a promise she was keeping to that long-dead family. She was choosing not just to live, but to create a place of life and shelter. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the world outside was a silent, glittering expanse of white. Thomas, weak but immensely grateful, looked at Mary with awe. He looked around the clean, repaired room, at the sturdy walls that had saved them. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Mary looked at the sleeping boy, then out the door at the peaceful, snow-covered valley. The fort was no longer a ruin in her eyes. When Thomas and his son were strong enough to travel, Mary helped them rig a sledge to carry their essential belongings back to Laramie. The story they told upon their arrival sent a ripple of astonishment through the town. They spoke of the cursed fort that had been a warm, safe haven. They spoke not of treasure, but of the quiet, capable young woman who had saved their lives with nothing but her own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to fail. The name Fort Mary, once a term of ridicule from Barlow, began to be repeated with a different inflection, one of grudging respect. The mockery started to curdle into curiosity. Mary knew she couldn't sit on her discovery forever. She needed to know its true worth. She carefully selected a few representative pelts, wrapped them in canvas, and loaded them onto Silas. The ride to Laramie was different this time. People didn't laugh. They stared. They whispered. She ignored them, her purpose clear. She didn't go to the General Mercantile. On Jed's advice, she sought out a man named Mr. Abernathy, a professional fur buyer from Cheyenne who was known for his expertise and his integrity. He was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands. He met her in a quiet room behind the land office. He unrolled the pelts on a large table, his expression shifting from professional interest to profound reverence. He ran his fingers through the fur, examining the leather, the color, the density. He was silent for a long time. "In 30 years," he said finally, his voice hushed, "I have never seen quality like this. The preservation, it's a miracle." He named a figure for the single silver fox pelt that made Mary's breath catch in her throat. The entire collection, he estimated, was worth more than most of the ranches in the valley combined. As it happened, Barlow was in the next room, arguing with the clerk about a water rights claim. He heard Abernathy's raised voice and pushed his way in, curious. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes falling on the lustrous furs spread across the table. Then on Mary's calm, composed face. He saw the respect in the professional buyer's eyes. All the bluster and arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. He had laughed at her for buying firewood. She had unearthed a king's ransom. He turned without a word and left, his humiliation a silent, heavy thing. The town's perception shifted for good. The whispers were no longer of the fool girl, but of the quiet woman who had seen what no one else could see. People began to ride out to the fort, not to pry, but to offer help, to be part of the story. Mr. Abernathy made her a generous offer for the entire lot, a sum that would make her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. But Mary looked at the papers he pushed toward her, and then she looked out the window, toward the mountains. She was thinking of a man named Jean Dubois and his daughter, Cécile. Mary sold only a small portion of the furs to Mr. Abernathy, enough to purchase proper tools, supplies, and a deed to the fort free and clear, with a tidy sum left over to see her through a dozen winters. The rest of the treasure remained in the cold, silent vault, a trust she was not yet ready to part with. She didn't want a mansion in Cheyenne or a life of ease. The work had become part of her. The fort had become part of her. With the money and the help of Jed and a few other hands drawn by the legend of her story, she began to restore the old trading post not as a monument, but as a living place. They rebuilt the collapsed palisade, re-roofed the main building, and turned the outbuildings into clean, simple cabins for travelers. She used a portion of the gold from the strongbox to establish a trust with the circuit judge, a fund dedicated to providing for orphaned children in the territory. She called it the Cécile Dubois Fund. The fort became what it was always meant to be, a beacon of shelter and commerce on the edge of the wilderness. Months later, the late afternoon sun of a new autumn cast a golden light over the valley. The fort was alive. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer, Thomas, the man she'd rescued, who had stayed on to help, rang from the smithy. A family whose wagon had broken an axle was resting in one of the guest cabins, their children chasing chickens in the yard. Mary stood leaning against a newly repaired section of the wall, looking out at the vast, peaceful landscape. Silas stood beside her, his soft muzzle resting on her shoulder in a familiar gesture of companionship. The harshness of the land was still there, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like home. Thomas walked over, wiping sweat from his brow. He gestured with his hammer at the bustling yard, at the solid, welcoming buildings. "You've done something here, Mary," he said, his voice full of quiet admiration. "More than just rebuild. What are you going to call this place now? Can't keep calling it Blackwood's Folly." Mary watched a hawk circle high on a thermal, its wings gilded by the setting sun. She thought of the deed that cost $10, the mockery, the cold, and the long-dead father's love she had found in the dark. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "It's not about what you own," she said quietly. "It's about what you look after." Thank you for staying with us for Mary Coulter's incredible story. It's a powerful reminder of the enduring power of stewardship and how true value is often hidden right beneath our feet, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. If her journey moved you, please give this video a like and share in the comments what you think the most important inheritance a person can receive is. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten places and the remarkable people who bring them back to life. She was 20 years old and left for dead in the Dakota Badlands. She had no family left to claim her, no money to speak of, just a worn brass compass and the clothes on her back. And with nothing, she dragged herself into a collapsed smuggler's dugout along the Missouri Breaks, a place forgotten by time and man. But what nobody knew, least of all her, was that beneath the rotted floorboards was a sealed iron strongbox and a coded ledger that would change her life forever. Settle in with us for this story and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Bess Harlow had been raised on the smell of pine shavings and oiled leather and the quiet competence of men who worked with their hands. Her father, a carpenter and sometime wheelwright, had been a gentle man who believed a well-made joint was a form of prayer, and he had passed that reverence for craft on to his daughter. But he had died of a fever when she was 12, leaving her and her mother with a small, hard-scrabble homestead and a legacy of good tools. Her mother, a practical woman worn thin by grief and hardship, remarried within 2 years. Her new husband was a man named Marcus Thorne, a land speculator with soft hands and a ledger for a heart, and he saw Bess not as a daughter, but as an entry on the debit side of his accounts. The warmth of her childhood home cooled into a place of silent obligation. The only solace she found was in the company of Jedediah Stone, her late grandfather's trapping partner. Jed was a man carved from the western landscape itself, weathered and quiet, and he saw the same steady spirit in Bess that he had valued in her father and grandfather. He took her on his traplines, teaching her how to read the subtle language of the land. The bent grass that spoke of a deer's passing, the smudge of charcoal that marked an old traveler's fire, the particular blue of the sky that promised a hard frost. He taught her how to use an adze and a draw knife, how to shape a piece of green cottonwood into a functional tool, and how to mend a leather harness with an awl and waxed thread. After her father's funeral, it was Jed who had pressed her grandfather's compass into her hand. It was a heavy brass instrument, its glass face scratched and its casing worn smooth by a thumb that was no longer there. "A good compass never lies, Bess," he had told her, his voice rough as bark. "It'll always show you true north. A person needs that." That compass became her most treasured possession, a tangible link to a love that was unconditional and a past where she had belonged. She learned to be quiet, to be useful, and to make herself small in Marcus Thorne's house. But she carried the compass in her pocket, a cold, solid reminder of her own true north. The end of her life at the homestead came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, the air sharp with the coming winter, when Marcus called her into the small room he used as an office. He did not ask her to sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the land her father had cleared and tilled, and he spoke to the glass rather than to her. "I've sold the property, Bess," he said, his voice flat and administrative. "All of it. A syndicate from the east is buying up the whole valley. The papers were signed this morning." She felt a cold stillness spread through her chest, but her face remained impassive. She had known this was coming, in the way an animal knows the feel of a coming storm. He had been selling off her father's tools one by one, and the livestock had dwindled to a few chickens. "Your mother and I will be taking the train back to Ohio. There are opportunities there." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding a kind of sterile pity that was worse than any anger. "There is no place for you in this new arrangement. You're a woman grown. It's time you made your own way." He slid a small stack of bills across the polished surface of his desk. $20. It was an insult dressed up as a settlement. "This should be sufficient to see you to Mandan or another river town. I suggest you find work there. Be gone by sunrise." She did not argue or plead. She did not cry. To do so would have been to give him a satisfaction he did not deserve. She simply nodded once, a short, sharp dip of her chin, and took the money. She turned and walked out of the room, her back straight. In her own small attic room, she packed a canvas sack with a quiet, methodical efficiency taught by Jedediah. Her spare wool shirt, a whetstone, the sharp skinning knife he had given her for her 16th birthday, a small packet of salt, and a length of cordage. She tucked the $20 deep inside. Lastly, she took out her grandfather's compass. She held it in her palm for a moment, the brass cool against her skin, and then slipped it into her pocket. She left before the first hint of dawn, without a word of farewell. She did not look back at the dark shape of the house, the only home she had ever known. She set her face to the west, toward the broken lands and the wide, muddy Missouri, and began to walk. The journey was a crucible. The rolling prairie she had known gave way to a landscape that felt ancient and hostile, a place of carved sandstone spires, steep-sided buttes, and deep, shadowed ravines. The Dakota Badlands were beautiful in their own stark, unforgiving way, but it was a beauty that promised nothing and offered no quarter. The sun was a relentless hammer, and the wind was a thief that stole the moisture from her skin and whispered of solitude in her ears. For 5 days she walked, and the skills Jedediah had taught her were the only things that kept her alive. She found water, not in flowing creeks, but in small, hidden seeps at the base of north-facing cliffs, places where the rock wept just enough to sustain a patch of green rushes. She read the tracks in the dust, giving wide berth to the sinuous trails of rattlesnakes and the heavy prints of a lone buffalo bull. On the 3rd day, she snared a lean jackrabbit, dressing it with her small knife and roasting it over a tiny, smokeless fire of dried sagebrush, the meat tough but life-sustaining. She was competent, but the land was a formidable adversary. The $20 from her stepfather felt like a joke in this immense and empty place. It could not buy her water or shelter. Her boots, stout and well-made by her father's hands years ago, began to fray at the seams. A gnawing exhaustion settled deep in her bones. She was heading for the Missouri River breaks, a rugged maze of canyons and bluffs where she had heard a person could disappear, could stake a claim on a piece of land no one else wanted. It was a desperate hope, a direction offered by the needle of her grandfather's compass. Then the storm came. It rose up from the northwest with shocking speed, a bruised purple wall of cloud that swallowed the sun. The temperature plummeted, and the wind turned into a physical force, tearing at her clothes. A cold, driving rain turned the clay soil into a treacherous grease. She lost her footing on a steep embankment and tumbled down, her canvas sack torn from her grasp and sent spinning into the roiling waters of a flash flood that filled the arroyo below. She watched it go, her spare shirt, her knife, her salt, everything but the compass in her pocket. Soaked, freezing, and now utterly destitute, she understood what Marcus Thorne had truly done. He hadn't just cast her out. He had sent her into this wilderness with just enough to give her the illusion of a chance, sentencing her to a slow, anonymous death. It was then, huddled under a rock ledge as the rain lashed down, that she saw it. Through the gray sheet of rain, she saw a dark opening in the side of a bluff across the ravine, almost perfectly concealed by a thick stand of skeletal cottonwoods. It was little more than a shadow, a place where the earth seemed to have been hollowed out. Hope, or perhaps just the instinct for survival, was a stubborn thing. When the rain lessened to a miserable drizzle, she picked her way across the slick rocks of the ravine and climbed the opposite bank, her muscles screaming in protest. The opening was the entrance to a dugout, an old sod-roofed shelter dug directly into the hillside. It was in a state of near-total collapse. The door, fashioned from thick, hand-hewn planks, had been ripped from its leather hinges and lay half buried in the mud. The sod roof, overgrown with prairie grass, had caved in on the eastern side, leaving a gaping hole to the sky and a pile of earth, tangled roots, and rotted timbers on the floor inside. She peered into the gloom. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and the faint, musky scent of pack rats. But it was shelter. It was out of the wind. With a final surge of effort, she crawled through the doorway. The interior was small, no more than 10 feet by 12. The floor was packed earth, uneven and littered with debris. Against the back wall, a crude fireplace had been built from stacked river stones, its hearth choked with old ashes and rubble. A rusted, pot-bellied wood stove lay on its side, its stovepipe a twisted ruin. In one corner stood the frame of a simple rope bed, its timbers gray and crumbling. It was a wreck, a place abandoned to the elements and the slow reclamation of the earth. Anyone else would have seen only ruin, but Bess, looking with the practical eyes Jedediah had given her, saw something else. She saw that the main support beam, A massive cottonwood log spanning the width of the ceiling was still sound. She saw that the stone fireplace, though messy, was structurally intact. The location itself was well chosen, sheltered from the north wind, south-facing to catch the winter sun, and hidden from casual view. It was a foundation. It was a place that had been discarded, a place no one wanted, and in that, she felt a strange kinship. This broken-down hovel was more of a home than the one she had just been forced to leave. She began to work, her movements slow and deliberate, clearing a small space on the floor with her bare hands, scraping away the debris and rat nests. It was a start. The work of clearing the dugout was slow and arduous. For 2 days, she labored with nothing more than her hands and a stout piece of fallen timber she used as a lever and a scraper. She dragged the collapsed sections of the roof out into the open, sorting the salvageable wood from the rotted debris. She swept the earthen floor, finding beneath the layers of dust and filth an assortment of pathetic remnants from a past life. A bent tin cup, the rusted head of an axe with its handle long since rotted away, a single forlorn boot with a hole in its sole. It was on the 3rd day, as she worked to clear the rubble from the stone hearth, that she made the discovery. The hearth was paved with large, flat stones, fitted together with a surprising degree of care. As she levered one of the larger stones near the back of the fireplace, she felt it shift under her weight with a dull, grinding sound. It was loose. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, cut through her fatigue. Using her wooden lever, she wedged it into the crack and pushed with all her strength. The stone was heavy, but it tilted upwards, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. Her heart began to beat a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. The cavity was lined with oilcloth, still supple and black despite the years, and nestled inside were 2 objects. The first was a small, heavy iron strongbox, about the size of a loaf of bread, its surface pitted with rust, but its construction solid. It had no keyhole, but a complex clasp of interlocking metal tabs. Beside it lay a leather-bound ledger, also carefully wrapped in a protective layer of oilcloth. She reached in and lifted the ledger first. The leather was dry but intact. Untying the cord that held it shut, she opened it to the first page. The script was a neat, precise hand, but the words were a meaningless jumble of letters and numbers. It took her a moment to realize it was a code. Columns of figures, dates, and cryptic abbreviations filled the pages. 12 CRTSWHKYRVDBR 7/18. 4 RFLSDLVDFTB 7/23. It was a record of transactions, a smuggler's logbook. She set it aside and turned her attention to the strongbox. The latch was a puzzle, but after several minutes of careful manipulation, she felt a click. The heavy lid swung open. Inside, nestled in what looked like faded velvet, was a small fortune. Stacks of gold coins, double eagles mostly, glinted in the dim light. She counted them slowly, her hands trembling slightly. There were 25 coins in total, $500. To a girl who had been dismissed with 20, it was an unimaginable sum. Beneath the coins was a small deerskin pouch, heavy for its size. She opened it to find a handful of uncut stones, a few dull-looking diamonds, a rough piece of jade, and what looked like a small, watery blue sapphire. And at the very bottom, sealed in its own oilskin packet, was a letter. She carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the stiff paper. The ink was faded but legible. It began without salutation. "My name is Silas Kane. I built this place in the spring of '58. I ran goods up the Missouri when the Army wasn't looking, and the trading companies were charging too much. It was a hard life, but it was mine. The money in this box is what I saved. It was for my son Thomas, but my partner, a man named Corrigan, betrayed me. I had to run, and I never saw my boy again. I do not know who will find this. Perhaps no one. But if you are reading this place and what is in it is now yours. Use it to build a good life, a life of your own making. Do not trust men who value gold more than their word. That is all the advice I have. May you find better fortune than I did. Bess read the letter twice, the simple, direct words echoing in the silent dugout. She felt a profound connection to this man, this stranger from another time. He too had been betrayed. He too had lost everything. He had left behind not just wealth, but a blessing. She looked around at the broken-down shelter, then at the gold in her hands. This wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was an inheritance. With the resources from Silas Kane's strongbox, Bess's world expanded from mere survival to the possibility of a future. She hid the ledger and the majority of the cash deep within the hearth, resealing it with the heavy stone. Taking 3 of the gold coins, she walked the 15 miles to the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings huddled near a ferry crossing on the Missouri called Lantry's Crossing. It wasn't much of a town, just a trading post, a blacksmith shop, a saloon, and a few scattered houses. At the trading post, run by a wary, hawk-nosed man named Amos Lantry, she moved with quiet purpose. She bought an axe with a hickory handle, a crosscut saw, a good adze, a hammer, and a bag of forged nails. She purchased sacks of flour, beans, salt, and coffee, and a slab of bacon. She also bought 2 sturdy pack mules and the rigging for them. Amos watched her, his eyes missing nothing as she paid with a gold double eagle. "Found a prospector's leavings," she said, her voice even, offering the explanation before he could ask the question. He grunted, accepting the coin and the story without comment. In the Badlands, people learned not to ask too many questions about sudden fortune. Back at the dugout, the real work began. Every swing of the axe, every pull of the saw, felt like an act of defiance against Marcus Thorne and the fate he had intended for her. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body aching but her spirit resolute. The lessons from Jedediah Stone came back to her, not as memories, but as a living knowledge in her hands. She felled several dead-standing cottonwoods, bucking the logs to length for the roof repairs. Using the adze, she squared the timbers, the sharp blade biting into the wood, sending fragrant chips flying. She rebuilt the caved-in section of the roof, laying the new timbers across the main support beam, followed by a dense lattice of willow branches. Then came the sod. She cut thick, heavy bricks of it from the prairie, the roots of the buffalo grass making a tough, fibrous mat. She hauled them on a makeshift travois pulled by one of the mules and laid them in overlapping layers on the roof, grass side down. She repaired the broken door, using planks from her salvage pile and new iron hinges she'd bought from Lantry's. She chinked the gaps in the stone walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass, sealing the dugout against the wind. It was during this time that she first encountered the other residents of the breaks. A woman named Maria Sandoval, a widow who ran a small freighting business with her 2 grown sons, saw her struggling to move one of the larger roof timbers. Maria, a strong, sun-browned woman with kind eyes, stopped her wagon. "That is too much for one," she said, her voice warm. For a fair price, she and her sons used their team to hoist the heaviest logs into place. While they worked, Maria shared a hot stew from a pot she kept on her wagon, and the simple kindness of the meal felt as nourishing as the food itself. A few days later, Caleb Blackwood, the blacksmith from the crossing, rode out to check on some traps he had set. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered man, with soot permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands. He saw her struggling with the broken door on the pot-bellied stove. Without a word, he dismounted, took the heavy iron piece and secured it to his saddle. He returned 2 days later with the door repaired, a new latch forged and fitted. He refused payment. "Good work should have good tools," was all he said, his eyes appraising the neat adze work on her doorframe with a craftsman's respect. Through these small, repeated acts of practical generosity, a community began to form around her, one built not on words, but on shared work and mutual respect. The dugout, once a derelict hole in the earth, was transformed into a home. It was small and rustic, but it was solid, warm, and entirely her own. The new sod roof settled and knitted itself together, becoming a living part of the hillside. The pot-bellied stove, with its repaired door, drew beautifully, filling the single room with a steady, radiating warmth that smelled of dry cottonwood and pine. She built furniture with the skills her father and Jed had taught her. A sturdy table from a single wide plank, a 3-legged stool, and a set of shelves against the stone wall where she kept her supplies in neat rows. She restrung the old bed frame with new rope and stuffed a mattress tick with dry prairie grass, a luxury of comfort after weeks of sleeping on the hard ground. Her life fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of the day. She rose before the sun, her first task to check the snare lines she had set in the surrounding gullies, which often yielded a rabbit or a prairie hen. She spent her days cutting and stacking firewood for the coming winter, hauling water from a spring she had discovered a 1/4 mile down the creek bed, and constantly improving her small homestead. She built a small, sturdy corral for the mules and a lean-to for storing hay. The $20 her stepfather had given her was long gone, spent on the first of her supplies. But the gold coins from Silas Kane's box represented a profound security. They were not just money, they were independence. She made trips to Lantry's Crossing every few weeks, one of her mules laden with well-cured pelts, to trade with Amos for things she couldn't make or grow herself. She became a familiar, if quiet, presence in the small community. They no longer saw her as a strange girl who appeared out of nowhere, but as Bess from the breaks, a person who worked hard and kept to herself, but was reliable and fair in her dealings. She mended a set of leather harnesses for Maria Sandoval, her stitching with the awl and waxed thread as neat and strong as any man's, and Maria paid her with a young goat that would provide milk. She helped Caleb Blackwood shoe a difficult horse, her calm and steady presence soothing the animal where his strength could not. In the quiet evenings, by the light of a tallow lamp, she would study Silas Kane's ledger. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to break the simple substitution cipher. The names and places started to emerge from the jumble of letters. Fort Buford, Standing Rock Agency, and the names of riverboat captains and freight haulers. She recognized one of the names, Corrigan. A man with the same surname now ran a large and prosperous freighting company out of Mandan, a man known for his ruthless business practices. She understood then that the ledger was more than a historical document. It was leverage. It was a form of power, a secret insurance policy against a world that had already tried to discard her once. She had no intention of following in Silas's footsteps, but the knowledge that she held a truth others would want to keep buried was a comfort, another layer of stone and sod insulating her from the cold. The first snow of winter fell silently in the night, and Bess awoke to a world transformed. The harsh angles of the Badlands were softened, blanketed in a pristine layer of white. From the doorway of her dugout, The only signs of life were the plume of smoke rising from her stovepipe and the tracks of a lone coyote that had passed in the night. The air was still and cold and clean. She stood for a long time, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands, and looked out at the quiet landscape. Inside, her home was a pocket of warmth and order. A small fire crackled in the stove, and the room smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the pine boughs she had laid on the floor. Everything in the small space was the product of her own labor, or had been given in a spirit of practical kindness. The smooth, adze-marked surface of the table, the sturdy hinges on the door Caleb had forged, the woven blanket Maria had given her in trade for a dozen mended grain sacks. Her gaze fell upon the small shelf above the hearth. On it sat two objects. One was her grandfather's compass, its brass casing gleaming softly in the firelight. It had guided her here, a constant reminder of a love that had taught her to be self-reliant. Next to it, she had placed one of the uncut stones from Silas Kane's pouch, the small, watery blue sapphire. It was not beautiful in the way a cut gem would be. It was a rough, cloudy stone, but it held its own light. It represented a different kind of inheritance, a gift from a stranger who understood betrayal and had left behind a legacy of hope. The compass and the stone, one from a man who had loved her, the other from a man she would never know. But both had provided her with a true north, a foundation upon which to build her life. She thought of Marcus Thorne, of his cold, dismissive words, and the paltry $20 he had thought was the measure of her worth. He had meant to send her out into the wilderness to be erased, to become a forgotten tragedy. But instead, he had sent her here. The $500 in gold, still hidden securely in the hearth, was more than he had likely earned from the sale of her father's land. The independence she had forged with her own two hands was a treasure he could never comprehend. He had tried to take everything from her, and in doing so, had given her the one thing she truly needed, the chance to build a life entirely of her own making, on her own terms. Bess Harlow was 20 years old and had been cast out into the Badlands. She had arrived with nothing but a compass and a memory of how to work. She found a ruined dugout, a place no one wanted, and made it her own. It was the best inheritance she could have ever received. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and rediscovery. If you were moved by Bess Harlow's quiet strength and determination, consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone you know who appreciates the power of starting over. We believe that stories like these remind us of a fundamental truth, and so we leave you with this question to ponder. What abandoned place or forgotten skill in your own life might just hold the foundation for building something new and lasting? We look forward to seeing you again next time.